Okay, so I'm gonna tell this story of what happened to me today at work because it was really cool and I don't really want to type it all out. Okay, so there is this guy that I was working with, well, I was working next to, and he told me, well, he does like these little, like a psychology tricks kind of thing. The first thing he did is he put four different objects. He put a counterfeit pen, he put a tape dispenser, and he put a stapler, and he put a keychain thing on the table. He's like, I'm gonna make a prediction. He wrote something down, and he said, he wrote something down. He folded it, and he put it. He's like, put this in your pocket and zip up your pocket. So I was like, okay. And then he's like, okay, now pick one of these objects, and I picked the tape dispenser. He's like, okay, now look at what I wrote down. And so I took it out, and it said, Jackie will pick up the tape dispenser, and I did. I was like, oh, that's so crazy. And then he's like, okay, well now I'm gonna do a personality test on you. I was like, okay, cool. He's like, this might take a while, and I was like, okay, that's fine, whatever. And then he said, okay, well I want you to picture, um, um, he's like, I want you to picture, the desert. And then I was like, okay. And he's like, you can take your time. It doesn't really matter. I was like, picture the desert. And then he said, picture, so you want to picture a ladder, a cube. Well, okay, desert, cube, ladder, horse, flowers, and a storm, and how the storm affects my like environment. I don't know how much time I have on this video, but he's like, well, tell me what your desert looks like. I was like, well, my desert looks like, dry, dull, the sand is tan, and there's mountains in the background, there's like a two-way street, and all this other stuff. He's like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting because the desert is how your life is depicted. I was like, oh, that's weird. And then he said something along the lines of, you think your life is dull, there is always, and he said you think that there's like, what did he say? He's like, you said that there's like a one-way street and that's weird. And he's like, was there any type of life on the desert? I was like, well, there's shrubs and stuff, but they're all dead. And he's like, oh wow, that's really interesting. He's like, well, your life is dull and you think this and that. And then he said something along the lines of, but there's mountains in the background and like you're toaster. He said that I was still like, what is this? Hold on. Hey, I'm gonna calm down. Toaster. And he said that my there's mountains in the background. He's like, well, there's still more ahead of you, and like you can always leave and enter this place because you have the street or whatever. And I don't know what he's saying. And then he's like, well, tell me. And then he said, tell me, calm down. Tell me about your, what was it, the cube. And I said, well, you know on Apple computers how they have that really shiny, like smooth plastic. And he said, yeah, I know. And so I was like, well, my cube is hovering in the middle of the desert, around 10 feet tall. And it's a big cube, and it's really, the side's really thick, but it's hollow. And it's pretty big. He's like, well, this is how you view yourself and how others view you. And he's like, this is kind of weird because, he's like, this is like your ego. I said, wow, that's weird. He's like, so you have like a really, like, it's like you think of yourself like highly, and he's like, well, this isn't really a bad thing. It's viewed subjectively, based on whatever. He said there's always people that have to lead, and there's always people that have to follow, and all this other good stuff. He's like, you think of yourself as really high and like kind of powerful, but that's technically not really a bad thing, and like that's how you think other people view you. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then he said, describe your ladder. And I said, well, my ladder's sturdy, it's blue, dark blue, it's next to the cube that's hovering, but it's not touching it. He's like, really? He's like, this is interesting. He's like, the ladder represents your family and how your family is related to you. He said, you are growing up and you have your family and you aren't that close. You guys are kind of separating and all this other stuff. And then he was saying how your family is sturdy, they're not like worn down, and all this other good stuff about how I'm still close to my family, but I'm not like the closest that I have been, and I'm starting to break away from them. And then they're not on my level. Like, I'm kind of detached from my family, some sorts, but we're not like completely on not talking, which is kind of true. And then the next thing he told me is, describe your horse. And I said, well, my horse is strong, it's patient, it's looking up at the cube, it's standing there, it's young, it has a nice long tail and all this good stuff. He's like, well, this represents your soulmate, your lover, whatever. And he said, this is good because your lover will be waiting for you. They like depend on you, they rely on you, they're patient for you, they're waiting for you, and like they're all waiting on me. So I was like, okay, well, I guess that's good. And he said, describe your flowers. I said, well, they're fake prop flowers. They have a plastic stem, and like they're just a few different colors. He's like, well, this is kind of like not that great. He said, this is how you view and how your relationship with children is. I said, well, I don't really like kids. He's like, yeah, if you had a child, he's like, is there any way like you will have a child? I was like, no. And he's like, well, I suppose if you ever met Mr. Right recently, then you are not ready for a child. I was like, oh no. He thought I was like 21 or 22. And then he was saying that my relationship with children is kind of platonic, and how if I were to have a child, or if I had relations with a child, it would be evanescent, like it wouldn't be real, pure, true love that I had for the child, which is kind of true because I don't really like children. And he said all this was sort of can change, all this can change definitely. And then he was saying with this, and the last thing was the storm, and he said, well, take the storm and how does it affect these objects? I was like, well, it's a purple sky and it's like there's lightning and stuff like that. He's like, well, this is how your problems are viewed, and like how all these objects takes place. Everything is still standing. And then I said, well, I told him, I was like, my horse is under me now, like it's under the cube. And he said, well, this is kind of how these things happen, and how your lover is dependent on you, and how they trust you to protect them, and like your family's still there next to you, and all this other good stuff. He was like, well, this is just like how things are viewed, and this is a psychology test and all this good stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's cool. And then I went home.